Hello, and welcome to the Future Food Finance podcast. My name is David Stevenson.
And my name is Paul Cuatrecasas.
And every couple of weeks, we like to get together to talk about big issues in the whole world of food tech. And we usually do two things. We usually talk a bit about kind of the latest stories that are out there in the food tech markets that we find interesting, both public and private markets. And also, whenever possible, we like to talk to an expert who's got a kind of bird's eye view of the sector. And this week, we've got Dr. Neil Stevens, who's over at Birmingham University, a sociologist, who's done a lot of work on the whole food tech market, and particularly alternative proteins and CELAG, cellular agriculture, the rise of alternative meats and all that kind of stuff, cultured meat, cultivated meat, all the terms you use. And we talk a lot about how society is going to really react to this rise of kind of faux fake meat. So we'll come back to him in a few minutes. But first, I thought we'd catch up, Paul and I, just a bit about what's going on in the markets. We talked a bit about it last time we got together, Paul. Gosh, it's got a lot better. Not. It's a dodgy home market out there. What's your read on it all at the moment?
Yeah, well, it certainly looks like the volatility will continue for a while. But that's where I would put the probability over 50%. Now, what's interesting is that some people have shown interest in this idea of price versus value. So I thought we could take a few minutes to look at a relevant company that's listed in the food tech sector, Beyond Meat, which people have talked a lot now because it's down 80% over the last year, and it's below
80%,
80, and it's below its IPO price.
Really?
And you think, well, that must be because of interest rates. It must be because, like other tech companies, they're down because the future cash flows that are projected 10 years out are now discounted back at a higher rate, right, because of interest rates going up, and therefore the present value is worth a lot less. But in Beyond Meat's case, that's not necessarily true. And I'd like to just perhaps share, David, on the screen a few slides. And I'd like to compare Beyond Meat to Zoom.
Okay.
Zoom I talked about, I think, last week or last time, and has performed very well as a company, but its share price has declined along with many of the other tech companies after the pandemic. I'd like just to look at that a little more deeply, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's see if we could get this sharing thing with a podcast.
Yeah. Let me see if I can share
two
my
or three
screen.
things at the same time. A disaster.
For anyone who is watching this, I will share my screen here and see if this is going to work. All right. So I've got the slide up on Zoom. Very quickly, you can see that Zoom's share price is more or less back to where it was 3 years ago. $75.50 in April 2019, which was just after its IPO and before it rose during the pandemic about a year later. Today, it's actually up over 100 because it announced quite good earnings 3 or 4 days ago. So it's risen maybe at a 10% CAGR. But look at its fundamental numbers, right? Revenue up 121% a year. EBIT, operating profit, up 380% a year. Net income and EPS, earnings per share, up 400% a year. And free cash flow, and this is what investors should love, is a lot of free cash flow, and free cash flow that's growing. Mm-hmm. That's up 274%. The last trailing 12 months ending April, which was announced just 3 or 4 days ago, $1.8 billion of free cash flow generated in the last 12 months. And it has net cash at the moment at $5.6 billion. When it did the IPO 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, it had much less net cash. It generated cash from the IPO. But today, $5.6 billion. This is a healthy company. This is a company performing well. It is not growing as fast, of course, as it did during the pandemic. But it is still growing, and it's doing well, and it's a good company. And it's probably, I'm not going to say undervalued, but it's probably priced a little more closely to its fundamental value rather than priced for perfection. Now, let's compare that with Beyond Meat. Beyond Meat is not only, was at its IPO price, it's now well below it. So its share price is down 30% from what we saw in the IPO days 3 years ago, back in March 2019. That's a pretty serious decline. You say, well, it must be interest rates and the tech market. Well, actually, that's an interesting question. So while revenue has grown 59%, Nothing like the Zoom 121%, but it's grown 59% a year. That's impressive. Gross profits have also grown 47% a year. Not like the Zoom 115%, but still, that's impressive. However, its losses have increased. And this is where it gets a bit scary. Its operating profit was negative 26 million at the time of its IPO. It's now negative 232 million. Net income even worse. And just to remind you, with Zoom, it dramatically increased its profitability and free cash flow. So it went the other direction. Zoom has zoomed up its fundamentals. Beyond Meat has lost more and more money. Now, we might ask, why is that? Look at free cash flow. Free cash flow was negative 3 years ago, 44 million. It's now in the last 12 months reported, trailing 12 months reported ending March, negative 324 million. And while it had net cash, a little bit of net cash back at the time of the IPO, today it's in debt, $610 million of net debt. This is not a pretty picture, David. Not a pretty picture. So yes, revenue's grown, but at what expense? At what expense? This is the key question for investors. It's lost huge amounts of money. It's had to raise debt to finance the losses. Its share price is declining. That's not a pretty picture. And the question is, really, what is Beyond Meat today? What is it? Is it just another plant-based meat company, of which there are many, many more than there were 3 years ago? Is it a brand name trying to compete with all the big brand names out there? And if so, that's a vicious game, as we all know. And we talked about that, I think, 2 or 4 weeks ago on one of our podcasts. That's a vicious game to be spending money on brand. And it could be that's where Beyond Meat is at the moment. The big question is it as unique as it was 3 years ago? Does it deserve higher margins? Is it able to innovate on the technology, on the intellectual property, on the value, on its own value chain to reduce costs so that it can compete at not just a gross margin level, but on an operating margin level? So that's what I wanted to share today. Nothing more special than that.
I was thinking that I've got this kind of mental idea that most companies that list have got a kind of 3-year window. Yeah. They list, they raise cash, they get the cash, and everybody expects people for them to burn that cash, because that's why they've given them the cash. They've given them the cash because they want them to grow, and they want them to grow via 1 or 2 or 3 mechanisms. Yeah. Either invest in intellectual property, invest in brand, or just invest in all of that, but CapEx, i.e. a factory, yeah, in the narrow sense of the word. But in a simple functioning way, an IPO should be a mechanism to deploy cash over a narrow window of 3 years to prove that you can then invest that money in something that produces a robust cash flow at the end of the 3-year period, yeah? Now, you and I can have a debate. Is it 2 years? Is it 4 years? It's certainly not 5 years. The markets don't have that kind of patience. My instinct is about 3 years. If you have that golden window of 3 years and you don't do it, which is effectively what we're saying with Beyond Meat, you're in trouble. If, on the other hand, you use that 3-4 window, which is what Zoom have done, to invest in brand, to build out their reach, global scale, and you start producing the cash, you will survive. And that 3-year window, and it seems to me that, there's a lot of companies out there that they don't make it in that 3-year golden window and start turning to cash positive, they're dead.
And I agree with you, David. And I think that's why, as we were saying last week, the private companies today, the private food tech and food tech ecosystem companies are so interesting and attractive, because today, in today's market conditions, they're not going to raise capital easily. They have to prove their business case and their business model. The valuations of the rounds of which they're raising money are going to be much lower, ultimately, than they were even 6 months ago, let alone a year or two ago. So the food tech companies today that are growing, that are having to prove their case, that are having to raise money the old-fashioned way at more normalized valuations, I find especially interesting. And the companies like Beyond Meat, I mean, look, they are good companies with great products. But they've got now a bit of a troubled history. And I have to say, probably they're a bit distracted. And it's one thing in a competitive market space that you don't want a management team to be as distracted. It's one of those things that also kind of catches you out and you're not aware of when you are being distracted because you are distracted. It's very hard to step back and focus, even if you have advisors and coaches, consultants saying, here's your blind spots. You're still subconsciously living with the distractions. And that could be a problem, not just for Beyond Meat. I mean, that's just one case study, but for a lot of these food delivery companies that have listed over the past 2 or 3 years, Deliveroo, Delivery Hero, even DoorDash, which is one of the leaders, they're suffering the, let's say, post-pandemic effects of a declining growth. We now have an inflationary market. Consumers are very aware of what they're paying for groceries and food and takeaway food. It's a real challenge. And
they may not even have 3 years.
They may not even have may not even have a year. And by the way, and that's true for a lot of the private. I mean, we read just in the last couple of days that Gorillas and Getir and Zap and there's a few others that have laid off employees. I mean, all Getir, they're all laying off employees, making redundancies, cutting costs because they're scared for the reasons we've just described. So some of the private delivery companies, some of the private, you call them food tech companies that have leveraged technology that have raised a lot of money at high valuations are now suffering the consequences, whereas the companies that haven't yet done that, and they're in the earlier phase of building something special and building it out carefully and maybe not so rapidly, a little bit more carefully, are really interesting companies to be looking at.
Well, I suppose just to finish off the thought, it's always the way with things. Web 1.0 created some companies like AOL that vanished and never went anywhere, but the real money so far has been made in Web 2.0. They're the Googles, they're the Facebooks. They've made the money. So maybe we've gone through iteration 1, which is in FoodTech 1, and FoodTech 2 is the place to be watching out for. Anyway, I'm aware of time. Paul, we've got to basically shoot over. I caught up with Dr. Neil Stevens from Birmingham University, talk a bit about how wider society, not the markets this time, but how wider society is going to deal with some of the issues coming down the track around alternative proteins and meats, particularly stuff coming out of the lab. Fascinating interview, well worth listening to. So anyway, over now to Dr. Neil Stevens. Welcome, Dr. Neil Stevens. Great to have you on our podcast. Now, we normally talk a bit about investment and economics, but we're going to broaden it out a little bit because you as an academic, and I'll get you to explain what your academic study is. You look at more the kind of broader societal themes and questions around disruption in technology and how that kind of stuff works. And we'll also talk a bit about the language used within this space. Cultivated, cultured, cellular, all these words get bandied around. But first, just give us a bit of background, your academic background.
Yeah, sure. So very pleased to be here. My name is Neil Stevens. I'm fundamentally a sociologist who's interested in innovations in biotechnology. I'm a assistant professor of science and technology at the University of Birmingham, and I've been tracking the emergence of a technology that I tend to call cultured meat since around about 2008. So primarily, I interview people who are involved in producing cultured meat. I'm really interested in the socio-political dynamics and the economics of how this, what really seemed back in 2008 when I started looking at it, was very unusual technology of trying to grow meat, producing meat without killing animals, and looking at how meanings came into being, looking at what type of institutions were formed, and basically, how have we got to the point that we're in now?
Okay, so I could ask you 1,000,001 questions there, but let's actually start with that language question. You and I have been watching this space long enough to know that other terms used to be used, like lab meat, which I noticed got ditched quite early on because I imagine it had fairly negative connotations.
Absolutely.
Where is the preferred language that people are using in kind of this lab meat alternative protein space? How's that evolved? Has that changed over time?
It's absolutely changed. So there seems to be, so first of all, there's kind of layers of this, right? You've got your alternative proteins, and that can include the kind of cultured meat that I'm talking about, but that can also often include, well, always includes plant-based meats. So people who are using mung beans or whatever to make burgers that taste more and more like beef burgers. You then have this umbrella of cellular agriculture, and that is basically people who are trying to recreate as close as possibly biologically foodstuffs that we're familiar with that come from animals, but without using animals or using animals as little as possible. So within cellular agriculture, there's then two subcategories, one of which is generally called precision fermentation. And this is typically for things like milk and egg, where people try to ferment to produce proteins that you would normally get from animals, to produce them without animals, to make something that's like milk or something that can go into ice cream. And then parallel to that, you have one which I call cultured meat, some people call cultivated meat. And there is a history of names that I can go into, which is people growing meat from cells. Do you want some of the history?
Yeah, I was going to say, absolutely, because it has gone. I mean, I through various permutations and names, I mentioned lab-grown meat, but what other terms have been used?
So lab-grown meat was almost only ever really something that was used by journalists or people who are trying to discredit it for making it sound weird and disgusting. Very few people who make this stuff like that term. Originally, people called it in vitro meat. This was mostly when it was academics talking to other academics. Then people went for cultured meat, which was meant to be more broadly appealing. Then there was this whole moment where the community moved towards clean meat. Some people argued very strongly that this was very compelling for consumers, that it increased the number of people who would buy it. But it didn't really work out. The clean meat term has pretty much been stepped away because some people just weren't convinced that it would be compelling for consumers, but also it really aggravated a lot of people. So clearly cultured meat is intended to reduce the global consumption of meat produced from livestock. And it kind of implied that livestock meat was dirty. It was quite disparaging towards the existing farming sector, really. And it got quite a lot, it caused a lot of tension. So people then moved on to cell-based meat for a while, which to me was an attempt to try to provide a name that would work well for regulators, because they were looking for something that was descriptive and accurate technically. I mean, like all meat is made of cells, right? So there was even questions there.
Exactly.
It was produced through cells. And at the moment, the last sort of couple of years, people are more talking about cultivated meat, which I see as kind of a happy middle ground. It's kind of a term that no one seems to object to massively yet. So that's where they are. In 2 years' time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, do tell. I suppose one group of people might object to one of those words in those two words, cultivated meat, is the meat bit. Yeah. And there have been people, particularly obvious lobbies, who've been pushing back against meat. Same with milk, actually. Talk about precision fermentation. Do you think that pushback from the traditional farming lobbies, we're saying, I think it's probably more in evidence in maybe France or America, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I've definitely heard it. Do you think that pushback is having any purchase amongst wider people, or the wider public? Or do you think that people are sort of going, well, it's not really meat, is it? It's something else?
I think the question of whether it is meat or not is, and how does it change what we understand meat to be, is a really important one. I don't think you need a farming lobby who are angry about this to make publics question what this means for me. I think that this moment of sort of like, say again, like, what exactly is this, is something that happens quite quickly and easily for many people when they first hear about it, because it's such a radical challenge to our conventional understanding of how meat is produced, while at the same time claiming it's the same thing. So at the same time, you're absolutely right to point to the work of organized groups who are trying to challenge the technology. The United States Cattlemen's Association is one of the most high-profile instances of this, where they challenged the USDA to make sure that the words like beef and meat could not be used to describe anything that didn't involve the slaughter of animals. And the culture of meat people would say, well, look, it's the same thing, just made in a different way. We can call it meat. So those debates are there. And actually, I anticipate that those will probably get stronger, or at least the challenge will be stronger. Early on, I always anticipated a lot of people would be critically engaged with this, but I didn't see much of it in like 2010. I think it's basically because people didn't take this technology seriously. It still seemed very science fiction. It still seemed very distant. The closer it gets, I think the more we'll see well thought through attempts by people against the technology to make their opinion be well known by publics and by governments.
I absolutely agree, by the way. Before we leave language and talk a bit about supply and demand, I just want to finish one other term that's now creeping into discourse language. Synbio. You do a lot of work around biotech, yeah, and this synbio term is creeping up a lot more now. Synthetic biology. Yeah. Does that that's not purely a food thing. That's a much broader spectrum of work. But do you think we're going to see a lot more synbio beginning to emerge in the food space, or is that going to remain really more an appendage of the biotech? Because it frankly comes out of the biotech world.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the precision fermentation stuff would see a lineage with synthetic biology. It's not the kind of term that I would imagine food producers would want to be associated with much in the public realm. So, a lot of these terms, they're not so much synthetic biology, but the ones around cultured meat, cellular agriculture, they're relatively new. They haven't been around for long, and people use them when they are useful. But as we've seen with clean meat, they also move them on when they stop being useful. So in terms of the technology, I think there's a connection there, but I can't see them putting
using the terms. So let's just talk about the demand and supply side of it. I suppose one of the language is very relevant here is because actually going back to this term cultured meat, another group of people who may not like the term cultured meat are vegans, for instance. I can imagine some vegans might go, I want nothing at all to do with meat. So what that speaks to is I think a much broader debate, which is about whether or not this whole industry is really orientated towards the low-hanging fruit, to use a mixed metaphor, which is the vegan community and the vegetarian community, who clearly are an obvious market for this, but they're quite small, quite niche, and the vegetarian and vegan markets are not the same. They're very different markets. And then you've got the flexitarian squad, which I probably sit in, who just happy to eat meat, but just want to eat less of it. What's your perception about, in those kind of three different groups, how the kind of cultured meat thing is changing? Because I get the distinct impression that when I talk to vegans, and I know a lot of them, my wife's vegetarian, but I know vegans, they're quite unenthusiastic about cultured meat, Whereas I find most people who quite like it, and demand side, are the kind of people like me. In a sense, do you see any sense of how society is changing in its attitude towards these various products?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you're quite right that many of the people involved in supporting cellular agriculture are vegan. There's a lot of the early investment was from like vegan venture capital firms who see, better than charity, strategic investment as the way to change the world. But the target market has never really been vegetarians and vegans. I mean, hey, if they're prepared to come in early and pay, and some of them, not all of them, but some of them prepared to pay a bit more money for something that will probably initially be more expensive, great. But remember, the vision here is to impact global climate change, to stop billions of animal deaths. And the way to do that is to make sure that it's fundamentally mainstream, that this is something that huge numbers of people eat. And as you rightly say, the vegetarian and especially vegan is a very small sort of sector. So maybe as sort of transitioning in, that would be a sector that you would go to. But if it only ever sells to vegetarians and vegans, it doesn't really do anything, because the vegetarians, certainly the vegans, are already eating plant-based diets.
Yes, that's the point. Yeah, and milk's an interesting kind of subcategory, isn't it? In many respects, actually, it's the poster child of this whole movement. My daughter, who's not at all vegetarian, uses almond milk, and she does it not because of animal product, because it just works better for her. That's a subsegment that has done phenomenally well, hasn't it? Are you sensing that that's broken into the mainstream? Because I sense it has.
Yeah. Just sort of plant-based milks as a category. It's not a new category in terms of the technology. I know that there are some people who are trying to make brands of plant-based milks that replicate a bit more the kind of the fattiness that you might get on a dairy milk, but these are generally very, very well established products that I simply think have seen an increase in market share. Absolutely.
I suppose the other question, I suppose, lurking in the back of my mind is that, and this is a really interesting question around where people, because there's various issues that we can identify here. You've identified climate change. A lot of people also identify processed food as an issue. Now, this is where it gets difficult, doesn't it? Really, because in many respects, for instance, cultured meat is very processed. Yeah, it's very processed, and I've heard more than a few people say, I don't want to eat food that's enormously processed. Now, I sort of say back to them, well, but it's not like most other food isn't very processed. So this is quite interesting. It's a real grey zone, isn't it, in terms of consumer preferences? Then that goes back to that clean meat debate, doesn't it? And how's your perception that people are changing? Because actually, I think most people accept that their food is processed, but there is this kind of pushback.
Yeah, I think there's this kind of idea of processing and then sort of super processing, and people like the fact that there are food manufacturers that make food that are convenient to eat, but at the same time, it can go too far and raise concerns. And there might be a bit of bleed here between conversations about plant-based meats and cellular agriculture, because this is really something that people lean in on things like the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Foods Burger, which are, their very core essence is about food science and looking to replicate the kind of flavor and nutritional profiles by technically intervening into what you produce. Now, processing in terms of the cultured meats it's almost difficult to conceptualize what processing would mean there. Does producing the muscle constitutes processing, or is the processing what happens after you've produced the muscle? Because if you look at the process of producing cultured meat, at the moment it's still relatively more small scale, but it would involve bioreactors, cultivators, essentially these large vats where people are controlling the volume. Things are pumped into them, pumped out. You drain it, maybe put it in another bioreactor, one for differentiation, one for proliferation. It's very process heavy. But is that processing? Is processing what happens afterwards? And I think what you often see from advocates for cultured meat when people critique things like that in cultured meat is that they would also this is particularly around ideas about, is it natural, for example? People sort of lean an eye and say, well, look back at what happens in factory farming and what happens in a lot of industrial farming today, and questioning how sort of natural and whether there's interventions or a lack of interventions in what happens in many farmyards. And of course, you can certainly see forms of intervention that happen in livestock meat. But I think actually cultured meat as something processed is not a conversation that I've seen as high profile as I think the naturalness one, which I think speaks to that initial kind of response that people give to it.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right to identify the word natural. I think is absolutely, and that actually maybe exposes a different fault line between the kind of sustainable farming lobby, regenerative farming, that soil association kind of classic position, which isn't necessarily vegan or vegetarian at all. Actually, it might have nothing to do with that, and that's a different kind of debate, isn't it? I suppose that this brings me to the supply side. And I suppose the $64 trillion question here is we hear a lot of stuff around new companies being set up, lots of exciting stuff. You've talked a bit about the process, but there is this whole debate about, this is ever going to scale? Will this ever scale? This has been quite a live wire debate. Lots of people in the industry saying, yes, we can. And I particularly hear that most vocally from some of the more, for instance, fish-based groups, because there's differences there. And then another bunch say, no, this will never scale. There's no way. There's no way you're ever going to get there. You're not an entrepreneur in the sector. You're looking in the sector. But what's your take on this whole scaling up debate?
I think it's the right question to be asking, and it's the right question to be asking because we don't know what the answer is. You typify it quite well. There's certainly people. So I'm not an expert in bioprocessing or anything like this, but there are people that I see who are clearly knowledgeable, got the expertise, and are confident it can be done. I also see people who are confident. Have the competence and the expertise who question whether it will be done. So. Certainly, a lot of the people who critique it come from a biomedical background, which is where this expertise comes from. And I think it is fair to say that when moving into cultured meat, people have to unlearn a little bit about how they think about and approach the affordability as well as the scalability of what's potentially realistic, especially in terms of like how you produce the culture media. And we're starting to see the emergence of pilot plants. A number of companies are, and the pilot plants aren't all that big, right? When I say pilot plants, I don't want people to think that there's sort of factory level things being produced. They're still sort of room sized, as I understand it, facilities. But they'll be telling. There's a number of things that are going on here. First of all, for scale up, you've got to think about your culture media. So you grow the cells on a liquid, and what goes into that liquid is very complicated, and you need to make it environmentally friendly. You need to make it cheap. At the moment, those liquids are generally use a lot of animal products. There's blood-based products, amongst other things, that go into them. You want to, as much as possible, get rid of those.
Yep.
So yeah, you need to make the liquid cheaper and more reproducible, understandable, and predictable. But you also have to recognize, and this is quite different to scale up in a lot of sectors, is that you're trying to scale up life. The cells are alive, and you're trying to grow what they do, grow them in a way where you can control what they do. And life, like any person you ever meet, sometimes doesn't conform to what you expect of it. It's not quite the same as scaling up other types of technologies, chemical technologies, because we really don't know how the cells will respond in these vats. Hopefully, in the coming years, we'll find out.
A couple of last questions then. You said in your opening you had a background more looking at the biotech industry, and actually, if you look at the biotech industry, there's another interesting kind of simile or parallel to this. Everybody looked at the rise of genomics. Everybody looked at the rise of CRISPR, and they thought, that's it. We're going to have an amazing wave of technological disruption come through. We're going to cure cancer in 20 years or whatever. There was a real sense that because we'd had these technological breakthroughs, we were going to see a deluge, a tsunami of products. And what we've actually seen, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is certainly an increase. There's a lot more interesting technologies and platforms emerging out there, but we haven't, and they've targeted things like, orphan diseases, smaller disease, and they're making real progress there. But, and they are, let's be honest, making progress in cancer treatments and everything. But we've not quite seen that massive disruption of the pharmaceutical sector that everybody thought. And it's not quite like nuclear fusion, where every 30 years it's just 30 years away. But it does seem as though every 10 years that I look at the sector, this is the decade we're going to see the big changes. Is there a danger that actually a lot of the kind of culture and meat sector falls into this category? Because I know I hear people say, we're definitely going to have products on the market within 3 or 4 years. Definitely. And I have this kind of sinking feeling that I have heard that before in other sectors. None of us can know the answer to this, but what's your sense of that concern?
Yeah, no, it's legitimate. It picks up on many of the things I was saying about scale up, because that's fundamental to its success. But it also picks up on much broader issues around how it would land sort of on the market, but also how it would land politically in terms of global take up. So in terms of you framed it in terms of thinking about disruption, and I think that's very interesting in and of itself, because the early companies, the first company started around 2015, they used quite a lot of this language of being disruptive tech startups. And I think that was an important way of speaking to the types of investors that were coming in. So you're getting a lot of ethically driven, often vegan, but not always vegan venture capital companies. And you're also getting a lot of venture capital companies that were really interested in innovative tech and tied into a kind of a Silicon Valley based language where disruption is valued. But over a few years, you saw some of the companies step back from using the D word, disruption, and talk more about wanting to transform the food sector, because I think that they saw the importance of trying to build allies that the word disruption didn't help you to build and make connections. So the framing has changed very much. The likelihood of radically disrupting markets is also, this is a really, really interesting one, because for cultured meat to work, for huge numbers of people who currently eat meat to eat it, which is what we were talking about earlier, you kind of actually don't want to disrupt the demand side at all. Cultured meat is not trying to get people to eat tofu. The idea is that the consumer will still go into the supermarket and buy exactly the same thing in exactly the same way, without making an active choice to be purchasing a different type of product. All of the change is on the supply side. It's on the production. It's about trying to produce the product in a more sustainable way. So you see people within the sector talking about, well, what will the impact be on rural communities, on farmers in this country and other countries around the world? And there is discussion about, well, there could be ways that farmers could be part of this, providing inputs. And sure, you would need some people who are giving you kind of donor animals, cell source animals, might be interested in rare breeds, something like that. And there might be scope for some farmers to produce things that go into the culture media, plant-based things. But at the same time, I can't see how culture meat can be massively successful in such a way that it eradicates a large proportion of livestock farming as we know it, which is the long-term ambition, without that fundamentally disrupting existing employment, existing rural communities, and having a significant impact on the lives of people who work in right now what we consider to be the livestock industry. Whether that will happen or not, a lot of questions, but it's a very real issue for discussion.
100% agree. One last question. If the ambitions of this sector are successful, and there is actually the disruption we're talking about, will it actually do much for climate change? Is it really something that could make a real difference?
That's another of the big questions. I think there are still. The community would love to tell you that it definitely will, and it definitely looks like if it's successful, that there would be a lot less land use, probably less water use. There's talk of there being less energy use, but sometimes people question, because you're going to have these massive factories, you've got to heat them up. Sometimes you'll have to cool them down, and there's going to be it's going to be relatively energy intensive. Other people talk to changes in the energy use and the environmental impact of existing livestock. So there's a moving target. And it's also whether, would cultured meat lead to actually, if cultured meat goes up, would that lead to a reduction in livestock meat? Or would it just result in more meat? Would people eat more meat from livestock and cultured sources, also in the context of a rising population? So, I think there's this idea that this is a very interesting way of pursuing that. But I think the long-term implications are perhaps more difficult to predict than some people in the culture meat community would like to suggest.
Lovely. Dr. Stevens, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. I hope you enjoyed that fascinating conversation. Join me and Paul next time. We'll be coming back in a couple of weeks' time. Might be a bit delayed because I'm on holiday for the next couple of weeks. But join us for the next episode of the podcast. In the meantime, eat well.
And sleep well.
Bye-bye.